Show. I'm Udayan Mukherjee. My guest today has had an extraordinary career. She was the first woman to be the chairman of the country's largest public sector bank, the State Bank of India. And when she retired, everybody thought that she's had such a stellar career. Maybe she would join a few boards as independent director and then put her feet up and quietly fade into the sunset. Well, she did join the board of the country's largest private sector company, Reliance Industries, but she surprised everyone then taking on the assignment of the chairperson and CEO of one of the world's largest and fastest growing technology companies, Salesforce India. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Arundhati Bhattacharya to the Business Today show. Arundhati, what a pleasure it is to have you on the show. Thank you very much for joining in.
Thank you then.
Well, as I said, I mean, you did surprise a few people because people thought that Arundhati's had a long career and now she will enjoy retirement. I mean, from State Bank of India to Salesforce India is such a big leap. Were you not daunted at the kind of diversity of the experience that you were getting yourself into?
Well, not daunted really, but a few of my friends did think I was a little crazy and kept questioning why I wanted to do something like this, take such a big risk. Because, when you take on something that is entirely different from what you've done for 40 long years, it means a lot of change. It means learning a lot of things. And, the chances of success are 50-50. That means, the chances of failure are also 50-50. So I did think about it a lot, and the fact is I had always been very interested in technology. As you know, in the bank itself, there was not a single technology vendor that I was not interacting with. And some of the top people of these vendors, means I had met them as well. And I knew in my bones that going forward, the whole world is going to need digital. And every business, it need not turn into an IT company, but it will need a very strong technology backbone in order to survive. I knew that. And because of that, when I got offered this, it was like a ringside seat into cutting edge technology. That was one very big incentive for me. And of course, during that 1 year of gardening leave that we are required to take after you retire from the bank, I had been talking to a lot of the younger generation in schools and colleges. I spent my time, in fact, interacting with a lot of them. And most of them asked me, what's our future going to be like? And I told them, well, it's not going to be the same as mine. You will have multiple careers. And you need to be able to unlearn, relearn, and, keep learning all the time. It's going to be something that you have to sort of try and inculcate within yourself right now. So when I got this opportunity, that was another incentive that, I've been giving a lot of gyan, so to say, as you call it in India, a lot of advice. Could I really walk that talk? Could I really do it myself? Could I have multiple careers? So that was the second one. And the third thing was, Mark Benioff had invited me to Salesforce Stars because I was still a little unsure as to whether I should do this. And while coming back, he presented me with his latest book called Trailblazers. And there were two stories I read on the flight back, and they both touched me. One was regarding Mark and Salesforce lobbying to fight more municipal taxes because these were meant to cure the problem of homelessness. Means, as you know, I've headed companies and I have been interacting with a huge number of companies. Till date, I don't know of a company that wants to pay taxes, and definitely not one that wants to pay more taxes. Okay, so this was something that really impressed me, that this company walks the talk. And the second one was regarding equality, actually, where he talks about how he ordered an audit to check that there was no gender pay gap. And he was so sure that there would be none that when the HR department told him that, once we look under the hood, if there is a difference, you'll have to cough up real money. And he said, go right ahead, because I have that commitment and I feel that we are okay. And please do it. And Salesforce ended up paying about $5 million to correct that gap at that point of time. And till date has spent about $16.2 million because we have this audit every year. And we have since then, of course, acquired a lot of companies. So it is done across the new companies as well. So, those were two things that really made me think that this could be an organization that would give me a lot of, added value. And that's the reason why I did the jump.
Yeah, and it must be refreshing to be called chairperson, right? From chairman of State Bank of India, because they never called you chairperson in the State Bank of India, did they?
That's right. That's right. Actually speaking, I did get my first cards printed at chairperson, and I got a note from legal almost immediately telling me this will not do, because the statute that actually created State Bank of India does not have the designation of a chairperson. And in many cases, where I have to file, for instance, in courts, etc., the statute has to accompany to show that I have the powers to do this. And because it didn't have a chairperson, they said either you go for a change of the act, but till the change comes through, you should be known as chairman. So I scrapped the cards and I thought, I had far larger battles at that point to fight. So I accepted the term chairman and, went on with it. Yes.
So SBI to Salesforce, as you said, would have surprised a lot of people. But I think when you started your career, your education and your background did not set you up, yourself up to be a top-level banker, did it? Because you studied literature, you came from a sleepy town in the eastern part of the country. When did banking happen? I mean, was it part of a plan, or was it almost by accident that you stumbled into it?
It wasn't a part of plan at all. And actually, I had science at my school level, and I was very keen on studying medicine. And by the time I left school, so ours was the first batch of the joint entrance exams, by the way. But I did manage to get a seat, though the syllabus on which this was being held was the state syllabus, that is in Bengal syllabus, whereas we had a different syllabus, but I still managed to secure a spot. But then, when I went around looking at the facilities, I found that the college had no women's hostel. So I would have to stay outside or in some working women's hostel. And frankly, the situation was such that, it was just not conducive. I just couldn't do it. The hostel was so terrible. And that's one of the things, by the way, that still holds women back as to where they will stay when they are, of course, things are far more improved now. You have a lot of PG accommodation. But in those days, this was something that was almost unheard of. So ultimately, my father was sort of met the principal of my school, and he said, you put her into literature because she has, I think she has a flair for writing, and there are lots of opportunities she can get, if she is in literature. So that's how I got into literature. But I always wanted to have a career. And when I was almost completing my education, the subject of what I should do next came up. And at that point of time, there were only two competitive exams where you needed nothing other than merit. No connections, no nothing. And one was the IAS and the other was the bank exams. Now, when I looked at the IAS, to my horror, I found that you needed knowledge of any subject up to the postgraduate level. And that had to be something other than a language. No, I didn't have that. That would mean I'd have to sit at home for a year and, really study for it. On the other hand, the banking exam was a very general kind of exam with just a paper on logic and on general knowledge and English. And I thought I could crack all three. So that was the reason why. And of course, my friends in college also sort of egged me on, sort of dared me that you have to, let's see you crack this. So I applied with so many others and I got selected and I got into the bank. And yes, at that point of time, nobody knew what I had to do. My mother thought that it was only counting notes and in fact asked me that, do you want to spend your life counting notes? Because that's the kind of idea they had about banking. But they also felt that this would be within an enclosed space, it would be safe. So they were okay with it. And then, of course, I discovered what banking all was. And I then, of course, went on to do the All India Institute of Banking Associates exams, which was mandatory for us. So 11 papers that give me a basic grounding of the various acts that are involved, the various practices that are there in banking. And the bank did a pretty good job of sort of polishing me and, making me ready for my career.
Yeah. And how is it to work in the private sector, Arundhati? After spending so many decades, I wanted to ask you this because, you have an insider's perspective now of both the public sector and the private sector. What are the essential differences? I mean, would you say one is much better than the other, or are your loyalties still towards the public sector, having spent such a lot of time there?
See, it's very difficult to get rid of loyalties after 40 years of service, right? But there are a lot of myths about the public sector and the private sector. And I keep joking with my colleagues that, once I retire from here, I'm going to write a book saying busting the myths of the private and the public sector. Because actually speaking, I'll tell you, at the core of it all, it is very similar. However, there are some grave dissimilarities as well. For instance, in the public sector, you don't have an incentive or a disincentive that you can give. Everything is fixed. So you have to really go out of your way to determine what other than monetary incentive you can give, what are the right buttons in order to really motivate and inspire people. In the private sector, simple solution, throw more money at the problem. Now, that is actually not a simple solution, because what happens is then you really are shortchanging what can be done by just looking at the compensation bit of it, but not really ensuring that the person is developing in the right way. However, the private sector does try to compensate for it by creating what they call a business partner from the HR side of it, to look at what is your development plan look like, and how can they sort of dovetail it into the organization's plan, which is, I think, a great thing, which again in the public sector we don't have, mainly because the public sector is so huge that to have a look at individual plans at every step would need a whole army of people, which probably we can't afford. But having said that, that doesn't really exempt you from trying to do something very similar. And therefore, there are good practices in the public sector, there are good practices in the private sector. For instance, in the public sector, I used to always think that people are so promotion crazy because they don't have any other compensation other than career. Well, let me tell you, in the private sector, people are equally promotion crazy, no matter what compensation you give them. So the fact is, people at the end of the day are very similar, and yet, the surrounding can be very dissimilar. And therefore, our responses to it are very dissimilar. And as I said, this idea that the public sector doesn't work, I don't know where it stems from. Because I was up till 1 in the night, every night, for the 4 years that I was chairman. However, in this company, for instance, there is much more emphasis on work-life balance. I can log any day off in a week. I can make it a 4-day week if I need a wellness break. And it is never questioned. In fact, it is celebrated that if you take a wellness break, it's good for you. You're trying to ensure that there's no burnout, because here too the days are long. Again, being an MNC, my day starts in the India timing of say 9:30 to 10 and ends by about 6. And then San Francisco, which is headquarters, wakes up at 8:30. So from 8:30 to 11:30, I have again calls planned. So there's very little, space in between. And sometimes you do need that one day off, just in order to feel that you're all there, or get some of your very personal urgent things done. And they allow it.
Yeah.
So I think, there is some places more trust in this kind of a setup, maybe because it's a smaller setup. But yes, the differences are very much there.
Yeah, you're right in pointing out that there is a myth that the public sector does not work. And I'll tell you where the myth comes from. People who make this assumption will point to instances of where the private sector has been allowed to enter the terrain of the public sector, and the public sector has crumbled or lost enormous market share to the private entrants. I mean, there are examples in telecom where BSNL and MTNL lost so much share to Bharti Airtel, for example, or in airlines where Air India crumbled and the Jet Airways and the Indigos took over. And even in the banking space where you come from, private sector banks have chipped away and gathered so much of the market share from public sector. And this is probably where this myth comes from, that the private sector is more competitive and more efficient than the public sector.
In a way, what you say is also the reason. The reason for this is really not the people themselves, but the enablement that they have. In the sense that we are very bound to processes. And unless the process is complete in all respect, you are not allowed to proceed. For instance, if you're talking about telecom has undergone huge changes, right? You had to be very, very nimble and agile on your feet to acquire the latest technology, which the private sector could do much more easily than the public sector. In the public sector, you have a whole long routine as to how you can actually do a contract. because you are supposed to be under the scrutiny of a lot of people as to how you are spending your funds because you have been funded from the taxpayers' money. But at the end of the day, what this ends up in doing is it ends up in making you non-agile. And that is the reason why, we believe, or at least I believe, that the public sector, if it is enabled in the same way as the private sector, you put them on the same platform and the same footing, things will become much, much better. However, for instance, when I was in the bank, I used to very much, look at the recruitment piece of it. And I used to agonize over it because to select 1,800 probationary officers, I had to go through 180,000 applicants because I had to make it available to one and all. And we used to do it in a space of 9 months. Now, in the private sector, for instance, you don't have to do any of that. You can make a recruitment tomorrow if you want to. However, even there, I have found, because you don't want to make a mistake in the people you're taking, the same 9 months are taken. So it's not that, there are that many differences. You can find a way out and become far more swift on your feet, even within the public sector. And if you look at the fact that, during my time, the amount of digital initiatives we took up in the bank and where we landed up, at that point, I think we were ahead of the private sector. So it can be done. You need that kind of, mindset. And then it's feasible.
At this point, a quick break on the show, but we shall return with Arundhati Bhattacharya in just a minute. Don't go away.
Rosyjscy dyplomaci oraz wskazany przez nas personel otrzymali polecenie opuszczenia terytorium RP w ciągu 5 dni. Rosja prowadzi barbarzyńską wojnę przeciwko Ukrainie już od ponad 3 tygodni, a my, inne państwa Zachodu, jesteśmy traktowani przez Rosję jako kluczowy przeciwnik. Dalsze tolerowanie tego typu nielegalnej aktywności służb rosyjskich stworzyłoby szczególne zagrożenie dla bezpieczeństwa Polski, ale także dla naszych sojuszników w NATO i Unii Europejskiej, z którymi koordynujemy wszelkie tego typu działania.
When it's the world's biggest news story, there's only one gold standard of journalism.
You are watching
Welcome back. You've been watching the Business Today show. I've been in conversation with Arundhati Bhattacharya, former chairman of the State Bank of India, India's first woman to be so, and now chairperson and CEO of Salesforce India. There is another myth which I want to talk about since we are talking on this subject, is that there is a lot of interference from New Delhi with large public sector corporations, particularly in areas like banking, where the chairman gets calls or chairman's senior colleagues get calls from ministers, and maybe loans are made on that behest. In all your time there at State Bank of India, did you encounter any such thing, interference from Delhi, calls from ministers telling you what to do or not to do?
See, the fact is, I'm not saying that there have been absolutely no calls. That would be telling an untruth, and I will not say that. However, it doesn't put you under any compulsion to do it. You know, there are ways and ways in which you can always ensure that you're not doing the wrong thing. Hundreds of ways of doing it. Because, you know, ultimately, if you cannot rationalize it on a piece of paper, nobody can force you into doing something which is not rational. So you have got to look at the rational, you've got to actually see the case and see whether it's a viable case or not. Let me just give you another example, for instance, if not loans. You know, things like postings. There would be a lot of pressure, you know, to post a person here, there, wherever, especially, you know, in respect of the new persons who are joining. We have said very clearly that the policy is, during the first 2 years of probation, absolutely no change is allowed. If you want to join, you join. If you don't, there will be others to take your place. And we stuck to it. We absolutely stuck to it. Even if it meant that a certain person would not join or would leave, so be it. So the fact is, you know, you've got to lay down your policy and then stick to it. If there is any such request, you've got to say, well, I have got to rationalize a decision that I take, and which will be under scrutiny by you tomorrow. So to do that decision, I have to have these things. If they are available, great. If they are not available, I'm sorry, we can't do it. So I think, you know, we have to be a little, what should I say, a little diplomatic in how we do it. But I don't think it's such an insurmountable thing. And it's not that people can pressurize you into doing something you don't want to do.
You briefly alluded to your husband right now, Arundhati. So permit me a personal question. You know, in an Indian construct, to have such a successful career, I'm sure your husband is very accomplished in his own field, but, you know, to be the chairperson of the largest bank in the country, did it ever come in the way? Did it create any social awkwardness? I'm sure you know what I mean, and I know what the answer will be, but were there any testing moments even in a young woman's marriage as you kept climbing the ladder?
Well, you know, I think both of us decided to give each one their own space. So there are many events that I have attended all on my own. In fact, once in a while, I used to tell my husband that, you know, you should put in an attendance, because otherwise they'll think that you're a figment of my imagination. And I don't want that. So very grumpily, he would agree to come along. But he said that he hated the shop talk, which normally happened in such events, you know. And I could relate, because, you know, when I went into any of his events, well, I couldn't relate to his shop talk either, because then I was sort of relegated with the spouses who were only busy, you know, discussing all kinds of other things other than stuff that really interested me. But I think, you know, both of us accepted the fact that, you know, we had our own space. We had to give that. Yes, many a times he didn't accompany me. There were quite a number of times I didn't accompany him. But we sort of worked it out, you know. We did. I think we are good at, especially women are good at making compromises. So, you know, where I found him to be not enjoying himself, I didn't make it a point, you know, of contention that he was not attending. I'd go on my own. And it was similar from his side as well. But we did have mutual friends, and we got on pretty well together. Some of my bank friends are his best friends, and some of his IIT friends are my very good friends. So, you know, we had a group that would still meet, and both would be able there. But yes, for formal events and all, many a times I go just on my own.
I also want to ask you about your board memberships, because you sit on the board of Reliance Industries, and you know, you would have been reading over the last few days the kind of information which is coming out in the country's largest stock exchange and the role of independent directors in probably being able to spot it earlier and preventing such things. Now, how important is it to be a scrupulous and vigilant independent director now that you have taken some board memberships? And do you think a lot of independent directors actually fall way short of the gold standard in such directorships?
See, at the end of the day, we've got to realize one thing. The directors are meeting the company only once a quarter, or maybe on the outside, if it's a big company like Reliance, maybe twice a quarter. Now, in twice a quarter, there is only so much that you can review and so much that you can sort of, look at. Now, if that is the case, then one has to understand that even by looking at what is being presented to you, you are at a disadvantage because the management will show you what they want to show you. So I think the merit of a director lies in being able to ask the right questions and being assured that the questions are being answered in as complete a manner as possible. And developing that can take a little time, can take, can actually take up quite a bit of your time, especially in the beginning as you get to know the company. There are companies, by the way, that, do 3-day offsites at their campuses and things like that. So I was on the board of one such company where we would start at 7 in the morning and end at 6 in the evening for 2.5 days. And even dinner would be with the company executives. Now that gives you a much better insight into what is the working of the company, what they are doing. So there are a lot many more casual conversations from which you can pick up a lot of things. But not every company is able to do that.
Arundhati, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Congratulations on a spectacular career, and I wish you all the very best for the road ahead. You've been an inspiration to millions of women and men across the country. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Amid the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Europe saw the world's biggest rise in arms imports in the past 5 years, a trend set to accelerate following recent rearmament commitments. How are arms traded across the world, and what is this industry's worth? International trade in conventional weapons is worth an estimated 100 billion USD annually. The industry's products range from light weapons to warships and military defense systems. Nearly 40% of arms exports originate in the United States, but Russia, France, China and Germany are also major suppliers. Europe shows the strongest growth in trade, 19%, a trend that should consolidate with the new Russian threats. Widely accessible weapons cause suffering and destruction. A global treaty aimed at reducing the irresponsible transfer of conventional weapons came into force in December 2014. Its strict criteria controlling sales aims to ensure participating countries avoid breaking international embargoes and reduce the number of weapons used for genocide, war crimes, or terrorism. Many of the 130 signatory countries, including the US, have still not ratified the arms trade treaty, while Russia and China have not even signed it. The International Committee of the Red Cross says there is still a discrepancy between political commitments and the ease with which arms are transferred to actors who do not respect international law.
When it's the world's biggest news story, there's only one gold standard of journalism. This is Ukraine's true danger zone. Up close and fearless in Ukraine's combat zone.
You are watching India.
Presented by eBix Cash. हर खुशी के लिए काफी है. Co-presented by CoinDCX, your gateway to crypto. Co-powered by Green Lamb Laminates, Gustakhi Saaf.
It's been 30 days since Putin's invasion of Ukraine began, but there are no signs of anything actually slowing down. The West has gone into a huddle. There have been high-level meetings, but Putin has signaled that he is prepared in all respects to escalate this war in a second wave. As India's most watched channel, in the world's #1 story over the next 60 minutes, I'm going to take you to Kyiv, to Moscow, and to Warsaw to tell you what we think the next 30 days is going to look like in this war. One month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine bloodied, battered, but standing. Western countries in top-level huddle to stop Putin. But the Russian president is in no mood to stop Mission Ukraine. Ukraine tremors hitting every part of the world. As the second month of the invasion begins, we're asking, when will this war end and how? We're going to start by telling you that this is what Ukraine as a country looks like 30 days after the invasion began. Vladimir Putin launched what he called a special operation to denazify Ukraine. A month on, the capital city of Kyiv hasn't fallen. It's badly damaged. Russian military has been bogged down, and a new Cold War has been triggered for real. Ukrainian cities now resemble ghost towns in neighborhood after neighborhood. But this has become familiar. Almost every day you're hearing basically the same thing. We're going to turn all of this on its head and forecast for you what's going to happen in this second month of this military operation. But first, what the 30 days have looked like.
"30 days of destruction. "30 days since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Innocent lives lost and an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. 1 month since the war in Eastern Europe began, it shows no signs of slowing down. On February 24, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in an early morning televised address, announced a special military operation in Ukraine with an aim to demilitarize and denazify the country. The first city to bear the brunt of Russian aggression was the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, located just about 75 kilometers south of Belarus.
We're all the citizens of a beautiful country, and we are fighting for our freedom. We're defending our freedom. Be prepared to protect your country on the squares of your cities and towns.
Thousands of civilians enlisted in the armed forces to fight for their motherland. From making concoctions of Molotov cocktails to direct confrontation with Russian tanks, and even abuses hurled to Russian soldiers' faces. Ukraine's common citizen showed indomitable grit and determination to protect their soil. Russian troops had already deployed missiles and launched air raids on Ukraine's military stations, even targeting civilian structures. As Putin and his coterie dangled the